Look at a map of Europe. The borders are jagged, chaotic, and organic. They follow rivers, mountain ranges, and centuries of spilled blood. They look like scars. Now look at a map of Africa. Across the Sahara, through the Sahel, and down into the southern plains, the borders are perfectly straight lines. They cut across deserts with geometric precision. They slice through forests at exact right angles. They look less like the boundaries of nations and more like the edges of a real estate development. This is not an accident of geography. It is the physical manifestation of a bureaucratic shortcut. For decades, the popular narrative has been that these lines were drawn at the Berlin Conference of 1884, where European powers carved up the continent like a cake. But the official record tells a different, far more cynical story. The Berlin Conference didn't draw the borders. It merely set the rules for a race. The actual lines were drawn later, in quiet rooms in London and Paris, by men who were profoundly, almost comically, ignorant of the land they were dividing. The past isn't dead. It's just hiding in your habits. And in Africa, it is hiding in the very shape of the nations themselves. The official story is that European powers, hungry for resources during the Second Industrial Revolution, met in Berlin to divide Africa. But the Berlin Conference, convened by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, was actually about preventing a European war. The diplomats in Berlin established the principle of effective occupation. You could not simply claim a piece of Africa on a map. You had to notify the other powers, and you had to actually occupy it. This triggered the scramble for Africa. But as the scramble accelerated, the European powers realized they had a problem. They were claiming vast tracts of the interior, the Sahara, the Sahel, the Congo Basin, that they had never mapped, never explored, and barely understood. When British and French interests collided in West Africa, they needed to establish a boundary between their spheres of influence. But how do you draw a border through a territory when you don't know where the rivers flow, where the mountains rise, or where the people live? You use a ruler. In August 1890, the Anglo-French agreement was signed. It established a boundary between British Nigeria and French Niger. The negotiators simply drew a straight line from the town of Say on the Niger River to Lake Chad. That same year, the British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, stood before an audience and delivered a stunningly blunt admission of how these negotiations worked. We have been engaged in drawing lines upon maps where no white man's foot ever trod, Salisbury said. We have been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where the mountains and rivers were. The sheer pragmatism of this ignorance reshaped the continent. Consider the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty, also signed in 1890. German Chancellor Leo von Caprivi and British negotiators Sir Edward Baldwin Mallet and Sir Henry Percy Anderson sat down to trade territories. Germany wanted access to the Zambezi River from its colony in southwest Africa, now Namibia. The British agreed. They drew a straight line extending eastward from the German colony, creating a bizarre, narrow panhandle that jutted deep into the interior. Today, that panhandle is known as the Caprivi Strip. It still exists, a geographic anomaly born entirely of a 19th-century diplomatic trade. These straight lines were efficient for European diplomats, but they were catastrophic for the people who actually lived there. The lines did not care about ethnic groups, trade routes, or historical kingdoms. The U people found themselves split between the British Gold Coast and German Togoland. The Maasai were divided between British East Africa and German East Africa. The Somali people were fractured across 5 different colonial jurisdictions. Families were separated. Nomadic grazing routes were severed. Ancient political structures were bisected by invisible lines drawn thousands of miles away. When the era of decolonization arrived in the mid-20th century, African leaders faced a monumental crisis. The borders they were inheriting were artificial, illogical, and deeply flawed. The obvious solution seemed to be to redraw them, to align the borders of the new nations with the actual ethnic and historical realities of the continent. But they didn't. The straight borders of Africa were born in the quiet rooms of Europe in 1890, when men like Lord Salisbury and Leo von Caprivi used rulers to divide territories they had never seen, simply because they lacked the maps to do anything else. But the reason those lines survived the end of empire was a decision made by Africans themselves. In 1964, at the Organization of African Unity Conference in Addis Ababa, the newly independent nations of Africa made a pragmatic, agonizing choice. They voted to keep the colonial borders exactly as they were. They knew the lines were artificial, but they feared that attempting to redraw them would plunge the entire continent into endless civil war and territorial disputes. They chose the flawed stability of the colonial map over the chaotic promise of a redrawn continent. And so the lines remain. Today, the Somali people are still divided across multiple states. The Caprivi Strip still juts out of Namibia, a monument to a forgotten German chancellor. Across the continent, border checkpoints split villages in half, and farmers cross international boundaries just to visit their cousins. The empires that drew the lines are gone, but the geometry of their ignorance is still carved into the earth. Culture isn't an accident, and neither is the map.